Welcome back to Sleepy History Stories. Tonight, we are not following kings into their halls or knights into their bright, polished legends. We are stepping into the dimmer corners of medieval life, into the smoke, the mud, the cold water, the sour air, the heavy yards, the dark kitchens, the mills, the pits, and the narrow streets where ordinary people worked until their hands roughened, their backs bent, and the day finally let them go. Because if you had been born into the Middle Ages without land, title, privilege, or family connections, there was every chance that your life would have been measured, not in adventures, but in chores. Not in freedom, but in obligation. Not in romance, but in repetition. And some jobs were worse than others. Some wrapped you in smells that no washing ever really removed. Some kept you wet from morning to dusk. Some covered your skin in dust, lime, blood, ash, or grease. Some forced you to handle the things everyone else preferred not to think about. Some demanded such constant effort that the misery was not dramatic at all. It was simply constant. A heaviness that rose with you and lay down beside you at night. That is what makes medieval labor so haunting. The suffering was not always spectacular. It was often ordinary, quiet, familiar. The kind of hardship that does not arrive once and leave. The kind that builds its home around you. So tonight, let us walk slowly through the working world of the Middle Ages and meet the people who made daily life possible for everyone else. The laborers in the fields, the workers in cloth and leather, the haulers, burners, grinders, diggers, washers, carriers, and servants. The people whose names were rarely preserved, though their labor touched nearly everything. And as the fire burns low and the room grows still, let us begin where so many medieval lives began, with the land itself. If you were poor in medieval Europe, there was a strong chance that your earliest understanding of work came from the field. Not a tidy little patch of picturesque countryside seen from the distance of a painting, but an actual field, heavy with damp earth, cut by wind and governed by weather. A place where work began early, lingered late, and never truly ended. The medieval field laborer did not work in comfortable shifts. He lived inside a cycle of demands. Soil had to be broken, seed had to be sown, weeds had to be pulled, hay had to be cut, grain had to be gathered, bundles had to be carried, tools had to be mended, fences had to be set upright again, and animals had to be watched, because a damaged fence or a neglected gate could undo a week of effort before supper. The most exhausting thing about field labor was not merely the weight of the work, though there was plenty of that. It was the way the seasons tightened around it. In spring, there was urgency. In summer, there was heat and the endless glare of long days. In autumn, there was pressure, because harvest delayed by rain or rot could become hunger in winter. And in winter, though growth paused, labor did not. Fuel still had to be cut. Animals still had to be kept alive. Grain still had to be threshed. Roofs still had to be patched against the weather. Everything in rural life leaned on effort. A laborer's body became a tool because it had to. Hands hardened. Nails broke. Shoulders thickened and then ached. Knees complained before old age officially arrived. The back learned the shape of bending and rarely forgot it. To romanticize peasant life is to imagine the landscape from a comfortable distance. To live it was to feel cold mud creeping into a shoe, sweat drying into rough cloth, and hunger following the workday home. And weather stood over all of it like a lord no one could challenge. The rain might come too late or too soon. Frost might creep over a field when the young shoots were still tender. Heat might crack the earth. Wind might flatten what had taken months to grow. A worker could do almost everything right and still lose. That was one of the deepest miseries in medieval agriculture. It required enormous labor without offering proportionate security. To spend day after day in hard work and still remain only one poor harvest away from want is its own kind of sadness. It teaches caution, but it also teaches a weary humility. The field laborer knew he was necessary. The village, the lord's manor, the town market, even the monastery, all relied on the people closest to the soil. But necessity did not guarantee ease, and it certainly did not guarantee comfort. The peasant world also blurred the boundaries between home and labor. Today, many people think of work as a place one goes and then leaves. Medieval laborers often had no such separation. The field was near. The animals were near. The tools were near. The fuel stack was near. The leaking roof was near. The work moved around the household like a second weather system. Water had to be hauled. Grain had to be ground. Food had to be prepared from scratch. Clothes had to be patched. And children, if they survived infancy, became helpers almost as soon as they could carry, fetch, or watch. This is why field labor deserves its place among the most miserable medieval jobs, even though it was also the most common. Its misery lay not in some shocking detail, but in its permanence. It was the background music of hardship. It was being tired before adulthood had fully begun. It was feeling the future arrive, not as possibility, but as another season of work. And yet there were trades even less comfortable than the fields, because some workers had to earn their living in places where the air itself turned unpleasant. Imagine now that you have left the open countryside and entered a town where cloth is wealth, appearance matters, and every respectable garment begins in a process far less respectable than the finished product suggests. Here you find the fuller. The fuller worked in textile production, which at first sounds almost graceful. Cloth, after all, is associated with merchants, markets, careful measurement, and the dignity of finished garments. But the fuller stood much earlier in the process, at a stage where wool was not yet elegant, and certainly not pleasant. Freshly woven wool cloth contained oils, dirt, and natural grease. It needed cleaning, thickening, shrinking, and strengthening so that it would hold together better and wear more usefully. Fulling did this, but the means were unglamorous. Cloth was worked with moisture and cleansing substances, and in many times and places that included stale urine, valued for its ammonia. No one designing a polished market stall ever wanted to dwell on that. But someone had to. Someone had to collect it, store it, stand near it, and use it in quantity. Someone had to work the fabric in that sour mixture, hour after hour, while the floors stayed wet and the air stayed heavy. In some places, cloth was trampled by foot. Workers stamped it repeatedly, kneading the fibers under pressure. It was repetitive, damp, exhausting work, the sort that punished the arches of the feet, the calves, the lower back, and the patience all at once. Even when water-powered mills mechanized some of the pounding, the surrounding labor remained messy and physical. Cloth had to be sorted, moved, monitored, rinsed, stretched, and dried. The fuller could not remain untouched by the process. The process lived on his hands and clothes. There is something particularly bleak about jobs that involve handling what everyone else agrees to forget. The finished cloth might be draped around a prosperous merchant, a church official, or a respected guildmaster, but the path to that respectability had likely passed through a room that smelled sour and human. The fuller existed in that gap between the polished surface and the raw truth underneath it. And because textile production could be economically important, the work was often relentless. Orders did not wait politely. Customers wanted good cloth. Merchants wanted profit. Town life depended on trades that transformed rough material into something valuable. The fuller made that transformation possible, but rarely received the dignity of the final product. He was necessary, and yet his necessity kept him close to substances and sensations everyone else found disagreeable. It is one of the recurring patterns of medieval labor. The cleaner the outcome, the less clean the process often was for the person doing the work. If fulling was wet and sour, tanning was worse. Much worse. Leather mattered enormously in the Middle Ages. Shoes, belts, pouches, straps, scabbards, harnesses, saddles, gloves, book bindings, armor fittings, and countless everyday items depended on it. Medieval society could not function without leather. But turning an animal hide into usable leather was one of the most unpleasant occupations a worker could have. A tannery was not the sort of place anyone wandered into for pleasure. Hides arrived heavy, slick, and still carrying traces of blood, fat, hair, and decay. The tanner's task was to arrest rot and transform that unstable material into something durable. To do this, he and his workers soaked, scraped, limed, rinsed, de-haired, and treated the hides through a sequence of foul-smelling stages. The smell alone made the trade notorious. Tanneries were often pushed toward the edges of town because no one wanted them nearby. If wind shifted in the wrong direction, a neighborhood knew it. If a person worked there all day, the odor followed him home with such loyalty that one imagines it lived in his hair, his clothing, his skin, and perhaps even in the cracks of his hands. Then there was the physical strain. Wet hides were heavy. Scraping required force. Knives and blades demanded care. Lime and other treatment mixtures irritated the skin. Bark liquors and soaking pits created a world of dampness, splashing, and repeated lifting. The tannery floor was no place for comfort. It was a place of labor in the most stubborn sense. There is an old sadness attached to such work. You are useful, deeply useful, and yet your usefulness does not make people admire you. On the contrary, it often lowers your status. Others benefit from belts, boots, reins, and packs. Others move through the world using the products of your labor, but they do not imagine the smell, the scraping, the wetness, the drudgery, or the condition of the person who made those goods possible. A tanner stood at the edge of respectable life, helping produce essentials while remaining symbolically associated with rot. His workshop was an unavoidable reminder that many nice objects begin in unpleasant transformations. Shoes may have looked fine in the market, but somewhere beyond the cleanest street, there was a worker scraping softened hair from a hide and breathing the scent of a world that civilization preferred not to face directly. Still, even the tanner might have looked with pity at one other indispensable profession: the gong farmer. The name itself carries a bluntness that medieval life rarely softened. In parts of medieval England, a gong farmer was a person hired to remove human waste from cesspits and privies. It was not symbolic. It was literal. Towns did not become cleaner by wishing. They became slightly less filthy because somebody climbed down into the filth and removed it. In any crowded settlement, waste accumulates. People eat, sleep, relieve themselves, and then hope not to think about what happens after. In modern life, an elaborate, invisible system often handles that for us. Medieval towns had no such luxury. Latrines filled, pits backed up, stench deepened. Disease found opportunities. And so a gong farmer went to work. Usually this happened at night, when fewer people were abroad, and the task could be carried out with a little less public humiliation. But darkness did not improve the work. It added cold, uncertainty, and bad footing. A worker might descend into a cesspit with buckets and shovels, scraping and lifting, knowing that the air itself could be dangerous. Fumes gathered. Men could choke or faint. Slipping was possible. Illness was always close by. There is a terrible intimacy to this kind of labor. The fuller handled stale urine. The tanner dealt with animal remains and chemical treatment. But the gong farmer labored at the point where a town tried to conceal its own body from itself. He worked inside everybody else's refusal. And because the job was so revolting, it was also socially invisible. People noticed a cesspit when it overflowed. They noticed the smell when it spread. But if the waste vanished in the night, the worker who accomplished that miracle disappeared with it, at least in the public imagination. His success was measured by how little anyone wanted to remember him. That may be one of the loneliest forms of usefulness. To be necessary in the most undeniable way, and yet to inspire not gratitude, but avoidance. The cleaner the street felt in the morning, the more people could return to pretending that no one had labored in darkness among the worst smells in town. Yet there was another category of medieval job whose misery came not from filth alone, but from sensory occupation. Smoke in the eyes, heat on the face, dust in the throat, irritation so constant that it seemed to colonize the entire day. For that, we moved to the burners. The charcoal burner lived in a world of controlled fire. Wood had to be stacked and smoldered carefully so that it transformed into charcoal, rather than simply burning away. This mattered because charcoal produced a hotter, steadier heat than raw wood, and was essential to smithing and many other crafts. But making charcoal was slow, watchful, lonely labor. The burner often worked near the woodland itself, tending mounds or pits where wood smoldered under earth and turf. Too much oxygen, and the burn was ruined. Too little, and the conversion failed. The process demanded attention over long stretches of time, and often required the burner to live in temporary shelter nearby. So here was a medieval job that combined discomfort with isolation. Your workplace was smoky. Your clothes carried soot. Your hair smelled of burning. Your hands were blackened. Your meals likely tasted faintly of the same smoke that coated your lungs. And because the site might lie away from the center of social life, the work also carried a lonely edge. You watched the burn. You adjusted the mound. You judged the smoke. You slept lightly. You woke to check again. And around you the forest remained wide, indifferent, and full of weather. The lime burner belonged to a similar family of misery. Heating limestone in kilns to make quicklime was useful for building and other practical needs, but the process exposed workers to heat, glare, dust, and dangerous material. Quicklime could damage skin and eyes. The kiln itself demanded fuel, labor, and constant awareness. It was not a trade for soft hands or healthy lungs. These are the kinds of occupations history often leaves in the side corridors. They are not colorful enough to dominate a legend, and yet whole industries leaned on them. Buildings stood because somebody burned lime. Ironwork became possible because somebody made charcoal. Heat, dust, and smoke formed the atmosphere of utility. The misery of such jobs lies in how completely they occupy the senses. After enough days near a kiln or charcoal mound, one imagines the worker no longer smelled anything fresh. The body became an archive of irritation. The bed smelled smoky. The blanket smelled smoky. The worker's own breath may have seemed smoky to him. To live with that every day is to discover that discomfort can become normal without ever becoming easy. But if smoke filled the air above ground, underground there was another misery waiting. One that replaced open sky with pressure, dimness, and a constant negotiation with fear. The miner entered the earth for a living. Even now, that sentence carries a certain dread. To descend below the surface is to leave behind daylight, breeze, and open movement. In the Middle Ages, mining could involve extracting salt, silver, lead, iron, and other resources, depending on region and demand. However it was organized, the work was physically punishing and potentially deadly. A mine was dark, close, and unpredictable. Passages might be narrow. Supports might shift. Water might seep through stone or gather where it should not. Air might stagnate. Dust might thicken the breath. A person working underground did not merely exert himself. He lived for hours in a place that seemed to resist human presence. Tools struck rock. Loads had to be hauled. Buckets had to be lifted. Ore had to be broken away, sorted, and moved. Every task occurred in a confined world where the ceiling mattered and the walls mattered, and the route back to the surface mattered. A bad sound could sharpen the pulse instantly. A crack, a crumble, a sudden settling of earth. These are not the kind of noises a miner easily ignored, and yet he returned. Again and again. Because families needed food. Because lords, merchants, and rulers needed metal. Because money glittered elsewhere, above ground, while the labor that produced it remained in darkness. There is a melancholy injustice there. The miner might spend his day extracting the raw beginnings of coinage, weapons, tools, roof fittings, cookware, and trade goods that would circulate through brighter places. Yet he himself remained largely unseen, coated in dust and fatigue. The market square displayed outcomes. The mine held the cost. Mining also aged people in a particular way. It narrowed the body's world. It taught caution, strain, and repetition under pressure. The miner knew how earth smelled when opened, how a tunnel sounded when healthy, how a lamp looked when air turned bad. Such knowledge was intimate, practical, and bought dearly. To imagine medieval hardship only as mud and wind is to miss the underground version of it. Stale air, bent posture, sore muscles, raw hands, and the mental toll of spending daily life in a place that could trap you. It is one thing to do hard work beneath the sun. It is another to do it where the sun is merely a memory waiting above you. Back above ground, another kind of misery turned not on darkness, but on repetition and dust. The miller's assistant worked in the shadow of machinery. A mill can seem almost picturesque from outside. water flowing under a wheel, sacks of grain arriving, flour emerging, bread following after. But the assistant inside the mill lived a much less picturesque reality. He hauled grain, moved sacks, swept dust, poured loads, monitored the flow, and repeated these actions until the body began to think in burdens. Grain dust was everywhere. It floated, settled, clung, and entered the lungs. It coated surfaces and clothing. It got into hair and eyebrows, and the corners of the eyes, combined with the noise of grinding stones and turning works. It created an environment that could be wearying in ways both immediate and subtle. The assistant did not usually enjoy the authority of ownership. He was the muscle of the operation. The sacks were heavy. The hours could be long. Customers might arrive impatient or suspicious. Grain was precious. Flour mattered. Bread was basic survival. The social pressure around milling could therefore be tense as well as tiring. Lift, carry, pour, sweep. Lift again, carry again. The rhythm of the mill was almost hypnotic, except that nothing about it was restful. Repetition in hard labor is not soothing when each repeated motion costs effort. It is cumulative. It settles into the joints. And then there was danger. Moving parts do not forgive distraction. Heavy stones and awkward loads do not become harmless simply because they are familiar. A worker in a mill had to respect weight, momentum, and the persistent possibility of accident. Medieval workplaces offered little in the way of protective design. Safety was knowledge, caution, and luck. Still, flour flowed outward from this harsh environment into something that looked far gentler. Bread on a table, dough in a kitchen, a loaf sold warm in the market. Once again, the social pattern repeats. The finished product appears calm, even comforting, while the labor behind it remains dusty, noisy, and hard on the body. From the mill, we can go naturally to another place where food began, though in a much harsher form. The butcher's helper lived close to appetite at its most physical. Meat in the medieval world did not appear already divided into friendly portions. Animals had to be handled, restrained, slaughtered, bled, skinned, cut, sorted, and preserved. The helper in a butcher's yard or slaughter area dealt with the practical burden of that transformation. This was work for strong arms and steady nerves. Animals were large, alive, frightened, and not always cooperative. The work surface could become wet and slick. Knives had to be sharp. Timing mattered because meat spoiled. Every usable part of an animal had value, which meant the labor continued beyond the first cut. There were hides, bones, fat, organs, blood, and scraps to manage. The sensory world of a slaughter space was intense. Noise from animals. Noise from workers. The smell of blood, steam, fat, and offal. Flies in the warmer months. Mud underfoot, mixed with things one preferred not to name too specifically. The helper might carry carcass parts, hold limbs, rinse tools, scrape surfaces, fetch water, salt meat, stack waste, or assist wherever there was need. Such a job leaves little room for illusion. It places a person at the exact point where nourishment and mortality meet. That is useful knowledge, but it is not gentle knowledge. The butcher's helper could not enjoy the comfortable distance that consumers sometimes place between their meals and their origins. He stood inside the process. There is also the matter of emotional dulling. To do such work repeatedly, day after day, one imagines a worker had to cultivate some practical hardness, not cruelty necessarily, but a narrowing of attention. The task must be done. The animal must be processed. The customer must be served. Reflection can come later, if there is time and energy left, which there often is not. And again we see the old medieval pattern. Well-fed households might sit over stew or roast and discuss other things entirely. Yet somewhere not far away, a worker had done the heavy, bloody part. The feast was visible. The labor behind it remained in the yard. Not all miserable work happened in workshops, pits, and yards. Some of it happened inside households, under roofs that were not your own, in service to comfort that you helped create, but did not personally enjoy. The lowest ranking servants lived that contradiction every day. To say servant is to say too little. Medieval service covered a wide range of tasks and statuses, but at the lower end were workers whose lives consisted of constant readiness, repetitive chores, poor sleeping conditions, and a closeness to authority that could make the day feel endless. Think of the kitchen servant rising before dawn to stir life into embers, fetch water, carry wood, clean vessels, trim scraps, haul pots, wash surfaces, and stand in smoke while meals for superiors slowly took shape. Think of the scullion bent over greasy cookware, ash, and greasy washwater. Think of the young household boy sent on errands in all weather, or the maid expected to carry linens, sweep brushes, shake bedding, warm chambers, empty waste, and answer instantly when called. The misery of domestic service was not only physical, though there was plenty of drudgery in it. It was also social. You spent your day close to comfort without possessing it. You carried dishes whose contents you did not choose. You prepared rooms in which you would not rest. You made warmth for others, and then returned to cramped sleeping space of your own, perhaps in the attic, by the kitchen near the stable, or wherever a low servant might be tucked out of the main household's way. Privacy was scarce. Time was not your own. The mood of superiors shaped the air that you breathed. A generous household might make service tolerable. A harsh one could make each day feel like an extended test of endurance. And because servants were often young, poor, or dependent, their ability to refuse mistreatment was thin. A great hall or prosperous urban home could look well ordered to visitors. Candles lit, food presented, floors swept, bedding aired, fires maintained. But no such order happened by itself. It existed because tired people rose early and moved quietly through a choreography of useful invisibility. That phrase matters. Useful invisibility. Many low servants were expected to be present enough to work and absent enough not to intrude. To be constantly available and barely noticed. To maintain someone else's daily ease while letting their own discomfort fade into the architecture of the house. There is a particular ache in that arrangement. To polish what you will never own. To carry what you may never taste. To warm a room in which you cannot relax. To know that your labor is seen only when it fails. Still, even this was not the end of medieval drudgery, because outside both manor and town, there remained the hauling jobs, the carrying jobs, the transport jobs, all the occupations built on moving heavy things through an inconvenient world. Roads in the medieval sense were often not roads in the modern sense. They could be muddy, rutted, flooded, uneven, or barely passable, depending on weather and location. Bridges were not always present where one wanted them. Wheels broke, animals tired, loads shifted. Travel itself was labor. The carter, porter, or pack carrier lived inside that reality. If you hauled goods by cart, wagon, or your own back, your day could become a study in friction. Barrels, sacks, tools, timber, ale, grain, stone, cloth, fuel, or building supplies all had to move somehow. And what seems like a simple task, take this there, becomes much uglier when the path is poor, the weather turns, and the load has no interest in being carried. A porter in a town shouldered weight through streets crowded with mud, refuse, animals, and people. A cart driver jolted over bad ground with every rut announcing itself through the spine. Deliveries did not pause because conditions were unpleasant. If anything, the unpleasantness was part of the profession. One can imagine the physical toll very easily. Neck strain, shoulder soreness, hands rubbed raw by rope, wood, or harness, ankles twisted on uneven ground, damp cloaks in cold weather, heat radiating from stone or packed earth in summer, the sense that your body exists mainly to bridge the distance between where something is and where someone richer wants it to be. The transport worker also had to manage delay, breakage, and complaint. If a wheel failed, that became your problem. If rain slowed the route, that became your problem. If a customer expected faster movement across a road that looked like a churned field, that too became your problem. These jobs are not always listed among the classic medieval horrors, perhaps because carrying has an ordinary quality to it. But ordinary suffering was the very substance of much medieval labor. A person who spent years hauling loads through miserable conditions was not merely inconvenienced. He was worn down grain by grain, and for many women, one of the hardest repetitive labors centered around washing. Laundry in the Middle Ages was not the small domestic task suggested by modern machines and detergents. It could be punishing work involving carrying water, heating water, scrubbing cloth, wringing it, rinsing it, and then drying it in conditions that often refused cooperation. Heavy household linens were no joke when soaked. Even simpler garments became burdensome in quantity. The washerwoman bent over tubs, hauled buckets, worked with soaps, lye, ash, or other cleansing agents, and handled other people's dirt at close range. In cold weather, the work could numb the hands and redden the skin until it cracked. In warm weather, it still exhausted the back and shoulders. If laundry belonged to a large household or an institution, the task multiplied itself without mercy. Washing sounds clean in theory. In practice, it was a wet, heavy, repetitive, often outdoor or semi-outdoor labor that required strength and patience. Sheets, underclothes, kitchen cloths, work garments, napery, all of it had to be cleaned somehow. The worker doing so stood at the meeting point of water, weight, and repetition. And there is something deeply medieval about a job that appears modest, but consumes an entire day through sheer friction. Carry the water. Heat the water. Sort the cloth. Scrub the cloth. Wring the cloth. Rinse the cloth. Lift the cloth again. Everything takes longer when no part of the process has been mechanized, and every stage requires human effort. Now imagine that your hands are already rough from other household work. Imagine winter air. Imagine the line of dirty items never seeming shorter. Imagine the laundry of people wealthier than you, people who can complain if their linen is not white enough, while you stand half chilled, half tired, and fully aware that the next load waits. For all that, the washerwoman's labour, like the servants, mostly vanished into other people's comfort. Clean cloth on clean skin, fresh linen on a bed, aprons and shirts fit to wear in public. Respectability, once again, purchased through someone else's fatigue. And then there was another profession with long days, low glamour, and a strange mix of motion and confinement. The messenger, or rider of necessity, especially for those not important enough to travel elegantly. A humble courier, town runner, or hired rider was not gliding through history as a romantic figure. He was moving because someone required movement. Messages, notices, orders, accounts, requests, warnings, small parcels, legal summons. Information had to travel, and often it traveled through the body of a tired person. A runner on foot faced distance, weather, and bad roads. A rider faced saddle, soreness, uncertain lodging, the temperament of the horse, and whatever mud or storm the route provided. To carry news in the Middle Ages was not necessarily honourable. Sometimes it was merely exhausting. One can easily picture the wet boots, the cramped shoulders, the poor meal snatched in haste, the worry of losing a document, the annoyance of arriving only to be sent somewhere else immediately. And because communication delays could matter financially or legally, the pressure attached to the work might travel with the messenger in invisible form. The message in the pouch may not be yours, but the burden of delivering it becomes yours entirely. You become, for a few hours or a few days, the legs of someone else's urgency. All these jobs, different as they are, reveal something central about medieval labour. Misery did not always depend on extraordinary danger. Sometimes it arose from the endless conversion of the human body into utility. Lift this, carry that, clean this, scrape that. Watch this fire, empty that pit, grind this grain, wash that cloth, run this road, serve this meal, and do it tomorrow as well. It is tempting to rank these jobs as if misery could be measured neatly. Which was worst? The fuller with the sour vat, the tanner at the edge of town, the gong farmer in the night, the burner among smoke, the miner underground, the assistant in the mill, the butcher's helper, the servant, the porter, the washerwoman? Perhaps the answer depends on what kind of suffering one fears most. Some would dread filth. Others would dread darkness. Others would dread the humiliation of serving close to luxury without sharing it. Some would fear injury. Some would fear bad air. Some would fear the sheer hopelessness of hard work that never seems to improve anything permanently. And that last misery may be the most universal of all. Not the spectacular accident or the unforgettable horror, but the steady erosion of the self through repetition. To rise, labour, ache, sleep, and do it again with little chance of escape. To know that your work is essential and yet grants you almost no authority. To see the products of your labour circulate upward into better lives while your own remains narrow. That is the emotional weather of many medieval jobs. When we look back at the Middle Ages, we are often drawn toward the visible and the dramatic. castles, banners, crowns, battles, cathedrals. But those things stood above an enormous foundation of human effort that was neither glamorous nor optional. Most of history was not made by people giving speeches from balconies. It was made by people carrying, washing, scraping, lifting, tending, and enduring. There is something strangely moving about that realization. The medieval world depended on workers whose names were almost never written down. The cleaner streets depended on them. The better clothing depended on them. The leather goods, the bread, the cooked meat, the functioning households, the carts of goods, the washed linen, the ironwork, the buildings, the roads, the markets, all of it leaned on the bodies of ordinary laborers. And because they were ordinary, they were easy to overlook. Perhaps that is why these jobs linger in the imagination once we finally stop to see them. Not because each one was uniquely grotesque, though some certainly were, but because together they restore the weight of reality to a period too often flattened into costume. Medieval life was not only pageantry and stone, it was sore hands around a wooden bucket, a cough in dusty air, a wet hem in winter, a back bent over a tub, a shoulder under a sack, a face warmed too close to a kiln, a body carrying home the smell of the day. And after the smell came sleep. If sleep came easily at all, imagine the fuller returning from damp floors and sour vats. Imagine the tanner with the stink of hides still clinging to him. Imagine the gong farmer after night work, moving through streets that would look cleaner by dawn because he had entered the town's hidden underside. Imagine the charcoal burner settling into rough shelter with smoke in his blanket. Imagine the miner blinking at daylight as though it belonged to another species of life. Imagine the servant finishing the last pot after everyone else has eaten. Imagine the washerwoman flexing her sore fingers near weak fire. Imagine the porter lowering a load at last and feeling the body continue to lean even when the weight is gone. These are not heroic images in the usual sense. They are quieter than that. But perhaps they are closer to the truth of how societies endure. Not through spectacle alone, but through labor repeated so often that it becomes invisible. And invisibility may be the cruelest thing of all, because to be tired is one burden. To be tired and unnoticed is another. The people doing the harshest jobs of the medieval world were often closest to necessity and furthest from admiration. They handled the substances others shunned. They occupied the spaces others avoided. They gave their strength to processes others preferred to meet only at the pleasant end. The bread, but not the grinding. The shoes, but not the hide. The cloth, but not the fulling vat. The clean lane, but not the emptied pit. The warm hall, but not the servant rising in darkness to light it. If there is one lesson hidden inside these miserable occupations, it may be this. The comfort of any age rests on labor somebody else would rather not do. Medieval life simply made that arrangement harder to hide. The technologies were fewer. The distance between raw process and finished product was shorter. The worker remained visible if anyone cared to look. So as the room grows quieter tonight, and the mind drifts through old towns and muddy roads and dim workshops, perhaps spare a thought for the people at the bottom of the picture, the ones whose backs carried much of the age, the ones who held up the world from underneath, the ones who knew, in their lungs and muscles and skin, what it cost to keep a society going. They were not kings. They were not chroniclers. They were not the people history most loved to name. they were the workers. And many of them were tired in ways we can still recognize across the centuries. They knew the ache of repetition. They knew the insult of low status. They knew what it meant to perform necessary labor while remaining easily replaceable. They knew that one day of rest did not erase 6 days of strain. They knew that weather, accident, debt, illness, and hierarchy could turn ordinary hardship into full disaster with terrifying ease. And still they woke, rose, and did the work. One more sack, one more hide, one more bucket, one more load, one more floor, one more fire, one more trip, one more day. That is the quiet epic of medieval labor. Not the clash of armor, but the scrape of tools. Not the feast, but the preparation. Not the proclamation, but the carrying. Not the pageant, but the strain beneath it. So if you had to choose the most miserable medieval job, perhaps the honest answer is that the Middle Ages produced no shortage of candidates. But perhaps the deeper answer is that misery spread not only through a few exceptionally bad occupations, it spread through the whole structure of life for those with the fewest choices. The fuller, the tanner, the gong farmer, the charcoal burner, the lime burner, the miner, the miller's assistant, the butcher's helper, the servant, the porter, the washerwoman, the field labourer, all stand before us now, not as curiosities, but as reminders. History was built by people who were tired. And somewhere, in the dark beyond the village roofs, while the rich slept and the bells marked the passing hours, somebody was still working. Somebody was hauling water. Somebody was tending a fire. Somebody was scraping a hide. Somebody was carrying waste out of sight. Somebody was coughing in dust. Somebody was wringing cloth. Somebody was walking home with the smell of labor still wrapped around them like a second garment. And that, perhaps, is where the Middle Ages become easiest to understand. Not in the castle, in the ache. Sleep well. Please, like and subscribe. Until we meet again, good night.